As I've probably mentioned to many of you now, I sort of have two projects going right now, and they're quite distinct. But there's some big meta ideas that connect them that maybe we can get into in the Q&A. So this project that I'm going to talk about is looking at the way that knowledge spreads in networks of civil society institutions. And in particular, I'm really interested in international development institutions. And these are not flat networks. These are very purposefully actually hierarchical networks. So the big question behind this multi-year project was, how are ideas, paradigms, truth, if you will, created, spread, contested, and adapted in networks of international development focused civil society organizations? And the original sort of idea and the questions behind the project was to be in dialogue with the literature around the globalization of knowledge, right? How does knowledge and how does culture spread? And there's a lot of work done in the realm of, say, cultural spread through capitalism, right? So McDonald's comes to a country and the kind of cultural effects it has through capital and capitalism. But I wanted to take the angle of international development, and I wanted to develop an argument that even in places where there isn't McDonald's, or there isn't even, the internet or even electricity in one of my case studies, there's still this interesting plethora of organizations that are connected to other organizations outside of these places, and thus you have a network of basically aid land that I think is very much spreading ideas and ways of thinking and talking into places that might not have access to them otherwise. This project is based around two multi-sided case studies, and it's a little bit complicated, so I'm going to slowly walk you through it. One case study looked at the US and Kenya and the way that they were interconnected, and the other case study looked at Switzerland and Kyrgyzstan. And many people are a little bit unsure about where Kyrgyzstan is, so I just have a little map. It's that little country with the big red arrow next to it. The green one, and it calls itself the Switzerland of Central Asia. So it's a landlocked country. It's very mountainous. It also claims that it's the only functioning democracy in Central Asia. They've had a lot of it's been a very sort of rocky ride, but they do have a democracy that is somewhat functioning. Right. So the networks. So as I said, these are not flat networks. They're very much hierarchical networks. So this is the US-Kenya one. And in the US, you have a foundation called the Christensen Fund. They're not a very big foundation. They spend about, I think in 2016, it was $21 million. And they're a grant-making foundation. They're not an operating foundation. They give grants. And their interest is something called biocultural diversity. And this is the idea that biological diversity and cultural diversity are linked, and we need to preserve and explore this link. And that by valuing cultural diversity, you end up valuing diverse landscapes and ecologies. And by valuing diverse landscapes and ecologies, you actually preserve cultural diversity. So sort of the paradigmatic example is sacred spaces. They say if you preserve sacred spaces and their sacred uses, you conserve both culture and ecology. And they operate in many different places around the globe. And I was especially interested in their link to a NGO in Nairobi in Kenya called the Kivulini Trust. It was something of a one-man show run by someone named Dr. Hussein. And the Christensen Fund gave them money and also used them to find local NGOs around Kenya that were aligned with their mission, that they could also give money to, both through Kivulini Trust and also sort of around it. So it's a rather complicated funding relationship. And I looked at one of these organizations, and this was called Waso Trustland. Waso Trustland is based in a small town in northern Kenya, in a very underdeveloped part of Kenya, called Isiolo. And it was also a one-man show, really, run by someone named Hassan Shano, who you'll see later on in the presentation. And Waso Trustland worked with a constellation of villages, of pastoralist communities in northern Kenya, in particular with the Borana people. And in particular, I focused on one village that Waso Trustland worked with, and this was the village of Beliko. And in Beliko, Wassertrustland ran or helped run a community forest association. So this was a local organization. I will get into kind of these spatial labels a bit later, but it was presented very much as a locally started, locally run organization in Beliko that was focused on conserving the local forest. So there have been a lot of ecological issues in the region with deforestation and with drought. There was a river and a forest next to Beliko, and the Forest Association was meant to conserve the forest, and it was actually within the Kenyan government had kind of, this was around 2010, 2011, had kind of shifted their laws around conservation and community management of conservation. So they'd actually given the mandate to these kind of community organizations to have some sort of real legal control over their natural resources, limited to some extent, but real. The other interesting thing about Beliko is it was quite geographically remote. It was quite hard to get there. So from Isiolo, you'd take a bus. The bus didn't go every day. It ran every third day or so. It was a very long, 3 to 4 to 5 hour journey. And Beliko, when I was there, didn't have electricity, and it didn't have cell phone reception. It was blocked by a plateau. So that's the first. And this is the second. So in this network, the big foundation is the Aga Khan Foundation, which is I feel like we could do a whole talk just about the Khan Foundation. They're very interesting. They are an operating foundation, so they run many of their own programs, but they're also a grant-making foundation. They also give grants. They have what to me seems a pretty big budget. So in 2014, it was $325 million was their budget. And they have an interesting model where they also have all of these local branches. So in my case, I was also looking at not just the Aga Khan Foundation in Geneva, but their local branch in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan in particular. And what's interesting is that because the Aga Khan Foundation is an operating foundation and a grant-making foundation, they also get money from other sources as well. So it's sort of this interesting hybrid model. The other thing worth knowing about the Aga Khan Foundation is it has interesting religious roots. So the Aga Khan himself is a religious leader of Ismaili Islam, which is sort of a subgroup of Islam. And it builds nicely on the earlier presentation about kind of Muslim movements and revitalization and all that. But they claim to be a non-sectarian, non-religious organization. But it's interesting that they do work largely in areas where there is a large concentration of Ismaili Muslims. So East Africa, Central Asia, South Asia, a little bit in West Africa. And they have this branch in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. And then they work with what they call a local NGO, which is MSDSP, which is the Mountain Society Development Support Program, which is based in Osh, which is a southern city. Bishkek is the capital of Kyrgyzstan in the north. Osh is in the south. But what emerged eventually is that they actually started MSDSP. So the local foundation, the local NGO label is a little bit nebulous. And MSDSP runs a number of programs particularly in southern Kyrgyzstan. And I was looking at one village where they were doing some work. And this is the village of Sarakamish. And in this village, MSDSP was running a climate change adaptation project, and they had started a climate change adaptation working group. So this is supposed to be a local group that was working on climate change adaptation. And the MSDSP program was a little bit more complicated than the Kenyan one. So in the Kenyan case, the forest conservation project was pretty straightforward. The climate change adaptation project is a little more complicated because it actually set up these working groups. Then the working groups attended workshops. In fact, the whole village attended workshops about what climate change is and what adaptation is, run by MSDSP, but ultimately planned by the Aga Khan Foundation in Bishkek. And then they were supposed to put together and design a little development project and actually bid for a mini grant. So all these villages that were involved in this program were supposed to put together a project and then bid for a small amount of money to actually do the project. So in the case of Sarıkamış, they had put together a project to build a canal. The sort of logic being that it was in a valley surrounded by mountains, and that every spring that there were mud flows and sort of small floods from the glaciers melting on the mountains, so they needed a canal to control the flood water. And they had been successful in their bid, so they had gotten, I think it was $5,000 to build this canal. Right, and we can I'll talk in more detail about the projects as we go. We can also kind of discuss in more detail in the question and answer. So the big question of this entire project is sort of how our ideas spread and contested and adopted throughout these networks. But it's a little bit too big for me to handle in this presentation. So I'm going to focus in on one subpart of this question, which is how knowledge is legitimized and accepted, in particular through discursively. So how are ideas labeled? How are typologies of ideas created? And in particular, I'm very interested in spatial typologies of ideas. So the way that spatial labels were used to label certain ideas, often actually in very fascinating, contradictory ways, to give them some kind of legitimacy. And the argument I'm going to try to put together is that two sort of obvious spatial categories were used, the global and the local. But they were used in interesting and complicated ways. So I'm going to make an argument about how their uses of the local and global label were linked to authority and authenticity. And sort of the straightforward story is that the global label, labeling ideas as global or expert or Western at times, gives them authority, and the local label, labeling ideas as grassroots, bottom up, gives them authenticity. But actually, often what I found is the reality was much more complicated. And in fact, often it was the local ideas that had to be sold as, ultimately authoritative and universal, and the global ideas that had to be given an authentic veneer, often when presented on a global stage. So a lot of this also revolves around who is the audience for these ideas. Who are these ideas being sort of sold to or presented to or explained to? So to start with expert knowledge. Actually, I want to go back to this picture real quick. Can anyone guess who the development professional is in this picture? Of the three people. Oh, interesting. White hat lady. Any other guesses? Yeah, so it's the gentleman with the white hat. And I think that sorry? Yeah, well, yeah, exactly, and I think that you can tell because he's wearing a suit, right? So it sort of gives him the professional Western veneer, but he's also wearing this amazing hat, which people wear in Kyrgyzstan. So there you have the local, and this is actually the climate change adaptation workshop that I was just talking about. So this is Pirjan, who ran these workshops, and he has already presented about what climate change is, what adaptation is, and then he has this quite complicated sort of framework where he has lots of boxes and asks lots of questions, and then he has people come and fill out various boxes about various things that are going on in the village and various things about climate change and various things about adaptation. So that's what the woman in the picture is writing. She's filling in a box. So the idea is that eventually through these participatory mechanisms, they end up with this proposal, with this plan to bid for the $5,000. So I think there's interesting dynamics in this picture about also knowledge extraction. How do you get at local knowledge and what does it mean versus this kind of top-down teaching? Right. Before I go into sort of the ideas themselves and how they're deployed, I think it's important to pause for a second and just mention that this is, of course, all located within the history and the context of the political economy of aid and development. And I don't have time to go into a sort of a complicated history of international development and its political economy, but I think it's worth noting that throughout this history, there's been this tension that I'm trying to explore here about how is knowledge legitimated, where are ideas coming from, right? So going from colonial roots, where obviously you have a very imposed sort of top-down view of what ideas are legitimate. Moving to kind of the state-centric modernization theory approach, to the neoliberal backlash against that, against the state. And then the rise of participatory approaches. So Robert Chambers making an argument that what we really need in development is bottom-up participatory approaches. We need to ask people what they really want, what we should do, and somehow get them to tell us. And then all of these frameworks, which are deployed in these networks, were developed to get at, what is it that people want. But then, of course, there's a whole counter critique to that, saying that actually these participatory approaches aren't that participatory. They're just a way to legitimize, what you would be doing anyways, and also that they ignore dynamics of power, right? So when you have participatory development, who speaks and who's silent, who's in the room and who's missing, and how do decisions get made, which is tied to a broader critique of democratic decision making. And allowing the majority to speak, often for the minority. But though there's been this rise of participatory approaches, and also the post-development critique, which sort of critiqued the entire development project, I would say there's been an enduring insistence on universal categories. So the UN Development Goals, now Sustainable Development Goals, and other forms of kind of insistence on, the development project as a universal global project. And I think that's been paired with kind of a return to positivism, a return to measurable impacts, accountability, RCTs, the rise of effective altruism. So again, this tension of, local versus global, where does knowledge come from? What ideas are legitimate? How do we decide that they're legitimate? Are they legitimate because you did a participatory exercise in a village, or are they legitimate because you ran an RCT? I think this is a very live conversation happening still in development, and I think in philanthropy and civil society more broadly. All right, so to get back to the experts. So expert authority was very visible in these case studies. And it's visible, for instance, in the Aga Khan Foundation's Kyrgyzstan office, because the three most powerful people in that office in Bishkek are Western, two are American, and one is German. The CEO is German. The research monitoring and evaluation person is American, and the CEO is American, and the fundraiser is German. So these are the top three positions of power. They're occupied by Westerners. And this was justified to me as a way for the Aga Khan Foundation in Kyrgyzstan to be linked to global movements and to get money. So getting money from other sources beyond the Aga Khan Foundation itself was very important. And it was explained to me that it was necessary to have Westerners to do this kind of work. Not just Westerners, but development nomads. And it was interesting how often this was brought up in my conversations, even with the Kyrgyz staff members of the Aga Khan Foundation in Bishkek and their partner NGO in Osh. So often I was told about the thoughts of the person they referred to as the international consultant. And this was a person, so I spent quite a bit of time with these NGOs, and this is a person I knew personally, and we were friends, and people knew that I knew who she was, but she was never mentioned simply as Lori. It was always Lori, the international consultant, told us, right? So even in the labeling, you could see how these labels of expertise are deployed to legitimize certain ideas. And this fits nicely in with the sociologist John Mayer's concept of others or advisors, these kind of global nomads who come in to create what he calls, in a sort of grandiose way, the world polity, by which he means the norms and the global movements and the consensus around, what is it that we should do and how we should do it. And in this case, it was around climate change adaptation, which was the baby of Lori, the international consultant. She was American. It's also, I think, interesting that she wasn't the American consultant. She was the international consultant, right? So it's not that I think Western is almost a little bit too narrow of a term. It's the cosmopolitan internationalism that was really drawn on for the sort of legitimacy that people were looking for. And this also fits neatly into epistemic community models. So this idea of the way that global cross-cultural authority brings legitimacy through epistemic communities. And the epistemic community idea was used to describe scientific consensus in the way it's built. But I think it works really neatly with development as well. But the story wasn't always so tidy. So though you have these Westerners coming in and their expertise deployed to legitimize certain projects, you also have local experts. Often these local experts were created through Western education. So in the Aga Khan Foundation's case, a lot of their top people who were had Kyrgyz nationality were in fact educated in the West. In fact, there were complaints in the organization that people were hired on the basis of their English skills as opposed to actual knowledge of development. And there was a lot of training and trips. Well, where, for instance, the human resource person in the Aga Khan Foundation's office in Kyrgyzstan, who is Kyrgyz, was flown out to Switzerland to learn about how to do human resources, which is, I think, very interesting as well. But this wasn't only a top-down project. It wasn't simply people at the top selecting people based on their English skills or flying them to Switzerland. It was also a bottom-up project. So there were also global experts sort of designated by locals. So this is Hassan Shano, who runs the Waso Trustland project in Isiolo, the small town in Kenya. And he was very much perceived as an expert in his community. In part it was because he could speak English and use a laptop and write grant applications. But he himself saw himself as kind of this link where he could go to, he presented himself as going to villages in the region, finding out what people really wanted, and then linking up to global flows of money. And the Christensen Fund was a big global flow of money for him. And he also presented himself as being a kind of expert in a pragmatic knowledge of the Kenyan state. So he knew the issues, he knew what pastoralist communities were struggling with in relation to the state, and he could link all of these levels, the kind of classic civil society positioning of linking the state and linking the market, linking the people. So he very much saw himself as an expert. He wasn't sort of told that he was an expert, in part because he could speak the language, and he also went to international conferences, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later because there's an interesting dynamic there. But it's important to ask, who is the expert knowledge for? And I think it was deployed in these case studies very much on all levels, right? So it was presented to people in the villages, whether it was about what community forest conservation was or what climate change adaptation is. Also was for global legitimacy as well, so it kind of functioned in a bi-directional way. Right. So then local knowledge. And what was interesting about local knowledge is the further up I went in these networks, the more I heard about local knowledge. So the most frequent conversations I had about participation in local knowledge was actually in the foundations in Geneva and San Francisco. That's when it came up the most. So for instance, in the Aga Khan Foundation's headquarters in Geneva, local needs and participation came up all the time. It was the project, the climate change adaptation project, was talked about as community-based, working with communities to address their needs. I was told that community is central, climate change is second, and there's a lot of use of the word empowerment in these headquarters. And I was also told by someone I spoke to in the headquarters that the Aga Khan himself told the staff at the Aga Khan Foundation to build on community interests and local knowledge and to trust the local people. So there's also a lot of talk about mainstreaming, and the idea that it was that you mainstream these big ideas like climate change adaptation into local needs. That was kind of supposed to be the connection and the tie. And then in Fund, this was even more intense. So their whole sort of identity was wrapped up with local knowledge because their interested in biocultural diversity. So this is Ken Wilson. He was the director of the Christensen Fund until 2015 when he retired. And he was very emphatic about this, that their funding is shaped by context, by what's important to people, by what people really want. And there's this great picture of him. This is from their website. This is Ken Wilson with an elder in northern Kenya. The elder is telling him about the honeybird, which leads people to find honey hives. So again, significant that this is on their website, right? There's clearly a performative element to this idea of local authenticity. What's interesting, though, is of course that this emphasis is itself a global trend, right? And it's a global way for foundations to justify themselves, often to a global audience, right? Often at conferences and at international gatherings. But I think it's very much about authenticity, about a way to gain legitimacy and power. This emphasis on real concerns and real issues. It wasn't about democratic ideals. It wasn't about innovation. It wasn't about getting new ideas from the bottom, right? It was about realness, which to me is very much about the kind of authenticity. And for the Christensen Fund, this was very much a part of their radical self-vision. So Ken Wilson told me that in trying to be responsive to the goals and objectives of the leaders of local movements, the Christensen Fund is fairly extreme in its decentralized approach. And the idea was that program officers are located on the ground, so in the countries where their programs are run, and that even the program officers themselves come from these countries. So the Christensen Fund is very proud of the fact that their program officers and program managers actually come from the countries where the program are run or were born there. What's interesting, though, is, of course, if you look at the educational backgrounds of these people, they're all educated in the West. So again, that tension emerges. But the question is, who is this for, and where is it performed? And authentic to whom? So this is Nurmat. He ran the Climate Change Adaptation Working Group in the village of Sarıkamış in Kyrgyzstan. And to him, it didn't seem like his knowledge was particularly authentic or local, right? He just wanted a canal. To him, it seemed pretty straightforward that, if your field is covered with mud every spring, you should build a canal. And the overlay of climate change adaptation was fine. But there was nothing authentically local to him about his perspective on these issues. So I think it's important to note, where is the local? And I think what becomes particularly interesting is to look at where these labels sort of collapse into each other and where the boundaries blend. So perhaps the most interesting case of this is Hassan Shano. Again, he's the head of Waso Trustland Project, which is in the small town in northern Kenya. And I had just been talking about him as perceived as self-perceived and perceived by his community as this sort of local expert. But what was interesting is that the Christensen Fund invited him to a UN conference on indigenous people. And he had this fascinating story about his experience there, because he was actually invited very much as a indigenous elder. He does not see himself as an indigenous elder when he's in Isiolo, but he was invited as an indigenous elder and very much found that he could speak as an indigenous elder as opposed to a development expert, which is how he sees himself when he's home. And he expressed a lot of discomfort in this position, but he also told me that at this same conference there was Maasai people, which is an ethnic group from southern Kenya there, and they came in traditional dress. And he was so struck by this because he sort of he had this moment of realization of how local cultures were globally valued, and he told me he became ashamed that he didn't come in traditional dress. He came in Western dress. And there's sort of this moment of realization of the way that localism can be, again, authenticity can be deployed to get global resources and global attention. So to him, this was this sort of eye-opening moment. And this is in his sort of telling of it when he became really interested in promoting biocultural diversity and cultural diversity. So again, the categories collapse in this moment. He's in a global conference. He sees himself as an expert, but he's there as an indigenous elder. And you see this a lot in the promotional material, for instance, in both of these foundations. So a lot of the promotional material talk about how they work with local organizations and local staff. TCF talks about being a staff foundation. But again, obviously all their staff members are very fluent in global norms through education. So just as indigenous knowledge is becoming professionalized, so professional or expert knowledge can become indigenized by the way that it can lay claim to local authenticity and identity. But I would argue that this isn't simply cynical, right? That this can be deployed very effectively by people on the ground, by people like Nurmat or Hassan Shana, to again get a piece of the pie, a piece of local resources, through these fluid identities. And where the tension lies, I think, was very much when I kind of asked the global foundations to try to reconcile this. To ask them, how do you put local knowledge alongside global knowledge? And there was a lot of discomfort in that for people. So the Christensen Fund, for instance, tries to use this buttress metaphor to reconcile it. So they talk about being a buttress. They do bring knowledge, but they also give voice. They do what they call thick grant making, which is, I think, their attempt to try to say we're sort of both. Yes, we're bringing ideas, but we're also extracting ideas. We're giving voice, but we're also shaping things. It was supposed to be a buttress to a wall of local interests and needs. And the Aga Khan Foundation didn't have such beautiful language about it. I don't think they had thought it through as thoroughly. And when forced to acknowledge that tension, they said, yes, we speak of the local, we engage with the expert, and there wasn't really a clean way for them to reconcile the two, to reconcile the fact that they're teaching about climate change, yet also claiming that this is a program that builds on local needs. So just to wrap up, I see I'm out of time. These two categories are obviously deeply integrated. Despite the propensity, especially when it comes to the global foundations, to treat them separately. The lines are nebulous. These lines are often crossed by the same actors, such as in the case of Hassan Shano. But they also build on each other. So expert knowledge gains legitimacy from local knowledge. Local knowledge can be constituted by global foundations, especially those that privilege traditional cultures or indigenous rights. And again, this is not necessarily cynical. So this power can be used to produce, to co-opt, to justify development work, not necessarily to repress or control its subjects, right? So in the case of these local movements, it was a way to get access to global resources. And ultimately goes back to an imagination of place, to how global and local is constructed and by whom and also for whom. And these are often very fluid categories, and the constructions can collapse. So you have the tensions and the contradictions in the categories. And I think the most interesting example of these tensions and contradictions, I'll just end with this example, is in MSDSP, which is the Kyrgyz local NGO in Osh, there was a civil engineer, an in-house civil engineer, that MSDSP used to actually draw up the plans for instance, the canal in this village. And this civil engineer couldn't be called a global expert in the way that these foundations think about global experts. He didn't speak English, he wasn't educated in the West, he didn't know how to write grants. But at the same time, he was also drawing on a kind of global knowledge, right? How to draft the plans for a canal to reroute water. So where does he sit in this? Locally educated, never left Osh, only speaks Kyrgyz, yet drawing on this other source of knowledge that's also a kind of universal. I think that's where the tensions in these categories really emerge. So I'm going to end there. And thank you for listening.